Thank you, Oliver. That was fascinating, by the way. So Jen's gone outside. She just wants to be embarrassed when I say that was really fascinating. And I have to say, having sat in this room many times, listening to people talk about the way that technology is going to drive the future of financial crime fighting, I wonder if we might actually finally be starting to nibble into that. But we're not going to talk about that now. As mentioned, we're going to turn our attention back to the question of geopolitical fragmentation, sanctions and all. And to discuss this, I'm delighted to welcome onto the stage Ned Conway, who's the relatively new Executive Secretary of the Wolfsberg Group. And if you don't know what that is, then you can leave now. But I'm sure he'll explain. Dara Fernandez, who's Sanctions General Counsel at Honeywell, and I think speaks for the poor corporate sector that is being overwhelmed by sanctions by people like David O'Sullivan, the EU sanctions envoy, and we're delighted that David has joined us. I think you've been in that position now for 2,000 years, or is it just 2 years?
But 2 years.
2 years, it's 2 years, okay. But has been a terrific supporter of us over the last 2 years. We really appreciate the time that he and his team have spent with us. And then Dan Tannebaum. Now, Dan has just got off a plane from New Orleans, and if you know anything about New Orleans, it's where the Super Bowl happened. And if you know anything about Dan, you know he's a die-hard Philadelphia Eagles fan. So all you Chiefs fans and all you Swifties, bad luck. But here is the champion. So Dan, congratulations on behalf of the Philadelphia Eagles. So let us start a little bit by considering the position of the banking community. Obviously, Ned, first question to you. I always used to ask people when I interviewed them at JP Morgan, because they seemed to think that coming to work for me was a good idea, which half of the Financial Times do you read first? Do you read the second half, companies and markets, all the numbers, all that sort of boring stuff? Or do you read the front half? This is when it used to be a newspaper for you young'uns. Do you read the front half first, which is all about the news and what's going on in the world? And I would argue that probably the front half is the bit that's driving what banks are thinking these days. But just give us an insight into geopolitics and banking in this day and age.
Sure, I mean, and thanks for having me. And I have to confess that when we had the pre-brief, we had this great conversation, and then Gonzalo reminded us that we're all going to be on the record here, and then we all kind of tightened up, and we agreed collectively that I'd give a really long answer to the first question and just run out the clock.
I'm going to loosen you up, don't worry.
So apologies for that. No, listen, I mean, from the bank's perspective, and you said it very well this morning, you know, with your master's experience, if you're a student of international relations or international security, and you're an AML officer for an international financial institution, it is a hell of a ride. And it's certainly been a hell of a ride, and it's going to be a hell of a ride, right? For us, we really see geopolitics, I would say, through kind of three lenses. You have the geopolitics of regulation and policy development. If you're an international financial institution, you have to grapple with the EU, the UK, the US, and then all the other different areas where you have subsidiaries. And we're seeing a lot of that stuff come to loggerheads with things like the Corporate Transparency Act or the beneficial ownership concepts, as you called them here, information sharing, and other areas. So that's kind of one problem set. You have another level of problem set, which is the geopolitics of criminal activity, right? And in that sense, you know, you could think of any crime that's a priority kind of across the board, like drug trafficking. But drug trafficking, when it's fentanyl, is the geopolitics of China, Mexico, and the US, right? Drug trafficking, when it's cocaine, increasingly in the EU, actually, in the UK, where we're seeing a huge spike in cocaine use. You're talking about the Americas with the ports, you know, in Europe, and the challenges there. And if you're talking heroin, you know, you're talking about the challenges that we have in Afghanistan, Iran, Pakistan, Turkey, East Europe, potentially even Africa, and all those routes. So a lot of kind of different geopolitical challenges to navigate. What I would say is the way we kind of adapt and evolve is a pretty easy way to say, pretty hard thing to do in practice, which is maximum levels of communication. So identifying all the different stakeholders that each of those geopolitical challenges implicate, and just talking to them as much as you possibly can to minimize misinterpretation. That's step one, and then step two behind that, which is important to understand if you don't know the Wolfsberg group, is to find the consensus view. So Wolfsberg is 12 member banks. We represent outside of the Chinese banks a large portion of the financial, the international economy. And we work on a consensus basis. So when we publish standards, when we publish principles, those are standards and principles that every single one of those member banks has both agreed to publish and agreed to live by. And that maintenance of consensus is kind of in its own way a maintenance of the international order. It's very, very challenging. It's where I spend the vast majority of my energy. But it gets us to a view that when we do publish, we set a clear kind of line where we think we should continue as an industry, I'd say.
So you mentioned it's been a hell of a ride for the banking sector. David, you and your colleagues are to some extent responsible for that hell of a ride. So I'd be interested, we've talked a lot about the work you've done on sanctions and so on over the last couple of years. It's been a kind of a shock to systems. So how have you seen countries kind of reshape the way they think about this issue in the context of the challenge that they have, I think, willingly embraced in the EU, first of all?
Well, I think, the shock to the system was the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I think we have to go back to basics because we sometimes talk about the sanctions as though they're the issue. The issue is we have for the first time in our generation, full-scale war in Europe, something I think many of us thought we had left behind us in the last century. So, I'm making this not to make a geopolitical point here, but just to be clear why we are where we are. I think the sanctions have to be seen in the context of a strategy of helping Ukraine push back against Russia and helping the rest of us make sure that Russia doesn't repeat this elsewhere. So, the military assistance, the macroeconomic assistance, humanitarian assistance, and so forth. This is all. The sanctions are a part of that piece. They are not in and of themselves an objective. They're an instrument. Now, we've never had the extent of these sanctions. For the EU, and we traded 15, 20 times more with Russia than the US did, this now covers 60% of all previous trade with Russia, import and export. We've never had sanctions which have reached down so deeply into the economic and commercial fabric of our countries. Previous sanctions, and I'm very familiar with the Iran sanctions, it was a one-product sanction, and it was largely a foreign ministry issue of persuading people to have an embargo on Iranian oil. Now we're talking about enforcement deep into our own economies. And here, it was interesting, some of the earlier panel discussions, you actually have the intersection of the AML piece, the export control piece, which is a whole universe unto itself, right? You could have a day just on export control, and now sanctions. And there is one of the tricks that member states have had to do is they've had to put in place a unique structure now to address the issue of sanctions enforcement. And in the UK, you've actually created a new Office of Trade Sanctions Enforcement. All our member states, because EU sanctions are adopted at EU level but implemented at the level of each member state, have had to rejig how they implement sanctions. And what I think is interesting, listening to some of the discussions about technology, I don't think we've yet connected the dots between the work on AML, which is organized crime and money laundering and so forth, the export control, which was about stopping the spread of dangerous technologies into the wrong hands, and now the sanctions, which are designed, of course, primarily to target Russia, not give them the technology, not give them the revenue, damage their ability to sustain this war, but still, it's all part of the same piece. And I think one of the challenges we will face, and maybe you want to talk about it later, is how we connect the dots between these worlds. I'm very struck at the different universes that coexist and are basically with similar objectives, but maybe are not connecting it. One small example, I was struck, one of the features of sanctions circumvention is shell companies, is the whole question of finance, and therefore, so it is a form of AML. And are we connecting those dots in the way that we could? Can we use artificial intelligence and other tools, such as was described by Google and HSBC, to address these issues? I think we're only beginning to scratch the surface of how that might look.
I was interested when and point well made at the beginning, where the banks are under pressure, not because of sanctions, they're under pressure because of the Kremlin's full-scale invasion. But I was struck at the beginning of the full-scale invasion by some meetings we had in France, and we were told, we've got it, don't worry about it, because our banks are really good at AML. They know what their customers are doing. And so we'll come to that in a second, because I think Dara will have a view on that. But Dan, I should have said at the beginning, it's with great thanks to Oliver Wyman that this panel is being sponsored. I got carried away by the Philadelphia the Eagles. But you're also a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. We accept other think tanks are very welcome, and a regular commentator on this question. So can you give us a perspective from the other side of the Atlantic, which is, after all, a long way away from Russia? On Russia sanctions first.
Well, look, this should be an interesting week. For those of you who are paying attention, we had an election. General Kellogg, the Ukraine envoy for President Trump, is due to speak in Munich this week and give the plan. I think anyone realistically doesn't anticipate anything earth-shattering beyond trying to freeze the borders of the current crisis and really giving away as much as possible to Russia in some attempt to drive this to closure. It's honestly still challenging to calibrate what the tenor is in the U.S. For those of you keeping score, we do not have a nominee for the Undersecretary of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, the chief political appointee who helps drive sanctions policy in the United States. That would be kind of helpful in this scenario. We don't have appointees in place in a number of national security roles that cover this area. And if you've been watching the election, we've got a president who's very focused on tariffs and has openly said they're not that focused on sanctions usage. And all of the remarks leading up to the election, Donald Trump talked about sanctions once in commentary at the Economic Club of New York in a question that was well posed by Raj Cohen. That was the only time he spoke about sanctions during the entirety of the campaign. So that to a certain extent, we're waiting to see how this new administration actually tackles the issues, and we're waiting to see how that manifests itself in the supposed plan that'll be announced this week. The authority is there. I mean, President Biden might have been too careful in the approach and the way sanctions were used, and I think giving credit to the prior administration that was extremely focused on unintended consequences. We've clearly got a successor that could give about any of those. So realistically, what we now need to see is what comes out of Munich this week. Who are some of the key appointees? But the authority is there. Secondary sanctions authority has been granted for over a year and a half. There's a lot more that could be done to pressure third country actors that are violating U.S. sanctions that the Biden administration was reluctant to go hard on. We've heard rumblings that the Trump administration will weaponize enforcement in this respect, but it's still quite early to really get a sense of how this falls into the priority of the new administration.
So I wanted to just come back on one point there, because it allows me to say that in December with some colleagues, we had the opportunity to go and spend time in Tokyo and meet with the sanctions community there, and obviously they're part of the G7 alliance. And one of the things that kept coming up is it's difficult for us because we import a large amount of LNG from Sakhalin-2 from Russia. And then when I watched the Japanese Prime Minister visiting the US recently, there was this commitment to buy LNG. So I suppose my question is, do we think that in his sort of profit-driven attitude, the new president might see deals to be done with places like Japan that essentially drives an anti-Russia mission by replacing oil, replacing LNG, whatever it might be?
In the abstract, yes, this is a deals-obsessed president. But remember, there were deals announced in the first term that have subsequently been announced again, like they're net new and never made good on previously. So follow-through is not a strength of this team to realistically think they're going to make good on actually holding Japan accountable for that. Obviously, what Ambassador O'Sullivan has to focus on, what others have to, is isolating Russia from the world. So if there's a viable path to replace goods and services that are purchased from Russia, I think there's a warm appetite there. There's a logistical element to this that also needs to be considered.
Okay, I'm an avid rereader of Art of the Deal, as you can tell. So Dara, When I think of financial sanctions, I think of banks. When I think of export controls, I think of corporations like Honeywell. But those two worlds are merging. So what's it been like to be sort of under an onslaught of what are traditionally tools that are implemented by banks?
Thank you. I have to say I absolutely agree with what David said, which is I'll start by saying we've completely missed the point yet of connecting dots. But I also want to take us one step back to understand my point and the conclusion, which is financial crime, I see it as a foreign language. For those of you who maybe speak more than one language, you understand that in order for you to become proficient in a language, you have to go through the route of learning. You have to start basic, and then you get intermediate, and then hopefully you get advanced. And at some point, if you're really lucky, you become bilingual. Banks have been learning the financial crime foreign language for years, right? They've had lots of teachers, whether it be regulators, whether it be technology companies that have supported, whether it be just a lot of resources specialized in financial crime. So banks and financial services institutions have had years of tutored financial crime language. Many companies outside of financial services are starting their foreign language courses in financial crime. And so they were very good at export controls, and that's why sometimes when you say, oh, banks are good, they're good at AML, therefore they're going to have this under control. The reality is banks also spoke a type of financial crime language that didn't include export controls. So we're all becoming more proficient in financial crime. I don't know that we are all learning from similar books, meaning I don't know that we've all connected the dots of how anti-money laundering, fraud, diversion is the unity of sanctions plus export controls plus fraud plus AML, right? So I think industries that haven't had the exposure to financial crime tutoring lessons are having a hard time catching up to maybe the more advanced peers in the classroom, A being financial service institutions. And I do think that while we don't, for as long as we don't recognize that and are honest with ourselves about the fact that we need to bring every student to the same level, we're going to be missing a big trick that impacts national security. And Juan said it yesterday, I don't know if he's around, but he was saying it yesterday, and I really agree with him, that this is about national security. This is not just about whether or not a component can travel, but it's how that component is going to enable the continuation of a particular activity. In financial services, you have the money, you have the liquidity, you have those assets, but non-financial services make those goods. And without those goods, you can have all the money in the world, but you're not going to be effective. You're not going to maintain the war effort with money. You're going to maintain it because the money allows you to buy those products. And so I think industry has had a tough time getting up to scale, but I think we all owe it to national security, to our own purpose towards defending national security, to make sure we bring them into this conversation. So
I want to just come back to the point that I'm going to come to you about this point. The banks are good at AML, therefore we've got it sorted. Now, there's obviously a very just over a year ago, the Executive Order 14114, which sort of reminded foreign financial institutions, if you like, of the pressure or the expectations that are on them. How has the industry kind of dealt with that? Because there are both US and non-US members of Wolfsberg.
Yeah, so first of all, related to that answer, I think the vocabulary is a key part of that, right? Mm-hmm. So, the banks don't understand the industry as well as we'd like. Mm-hmm. So first, we need to have a little bit of humility, and the most successful situations we've had is where we've had the humility to sit down with our corporate partners and actually understand how global food supply chains work, that kind of stuff, right? With the executive order, this goes back to the concept of communication, which is, if you have a little bit of humility, and you've also been able to build trust with the OFACs and the offices of the world, then you can have very adult conversations, sitting down together at a table and explaining to them what is working and what is not working, you know? And the moment you build enough trust where the government side of the house is willing to tell you or explain to you what the effect is that they're trying to achieve, then you can have a really good conversation about the best way to do that based off of our knowledge, based off yours. Historically, it hasn't been that. It's been do this, do that, and they've kind of kept their ultimate effects kind of here, and even FATF is starting to do the same thing. So if you can build that level of trust where the government is willing to explain to you what their actual objective is, then the people like us can sit at the table and figure out the best way to implement that. The last thing I'll say too is that, and for the compliance officers in the world and in the banks, it's not just humility working with the industry, it's also humility working with your business, because they also have an angle here. You have your 20 years in JP Morgan where you know compliance officers, they're afraid to admit that they don't understand something, right? And we're in a new world here where these sorts of export controls are increasingly complex. And if you don't have the humility to recognize that, then you're not worth much these days.
So before I come to David to ask him a question about his globe-trotting, just a reminder, if you want to ask questions, please do send them through on Slido, because otherwise you'll be sitting there shouting at me and thinking, come on, ask the question I want you to ask. So David, just maybe to pick up on this, because you've obviously visited a lot of third countries, as we call them. And in those countries, obviously, you're having a very specific conversation about what we would like those third countries to do. So I wonder, I know it focuses a lot on the critical high priorities and so on. So if you could just sort of shine a light on that, but also if there is anything you can say about how this question of foreign financial institutions involvement comes up, that might be interesting.
Well, I mean, to use an Irish expression, the starting point of visiting these countries is ideally I wouldn't start from here, right? I mean, I would start with UN mandated sanctions. That is a much easier request when you're dealing with third country partners. The unilateral nature of our sanctions, we know the reason why, because Russia is not going to agree to sanction itself, and we have a dramatic sort of paralysis of the United Nations. But you combine that with the fact that, let's be honest, the G7 plus, even though we represent a large part of the world economy, we don't have too many friends out there, right? Not everyone feels the same way about this conflict in Ukraine as we do. And for many, their attitude is, well, here come the Europeans with, another internal squabble, and we're being asked to pay a price for it. So, and some of it is profiteering, right? There is an extent, not by governments, but by companies who see money to be made from evading sanctions, and I understand that. But the global enforcement of these sanctions is seriously handicapped by the fact that they are not UN mandated, and it's perfectly legitimate and reasonable for companies in third countries to trade with Russia. We haven't even had a full-scale embargo on Russian oil exports, right? So for other reasons, we didn't want to disturb the global south. We didn't want to disrupt the U.S. election. So we've allowed Russia to continue to gain revenue from oil exports. We've tried to deal with that through the price cap. I have never tried with the third countries either the high moral ground argument, or the sort of, you must align with our sanctions. We have deliberately focused on the issue of advanced technology and items which go directly into the Russian military machine. And that argument is quite persuasive, because most countries do not want to be involved in any trade which ultimately feeds the military. The other element which you're talking about, I think, Tom, is the reputational one. Clearly, the fear of U.S. secondary sanctions, and we could have another debate about secondary sanctions. I spent much of my life fighting U.S. secondary sanctions. Now I start to have some sympathy for the concept, but the fear of secondary sanctions definitely drives the financial institutions in all third countries. I mean, the idea of being cut off from the dollar system is absolutely terrifying for them. So most of the countries I go to complain about their financial sector having over-compliance, which was something they talked about in the previous panel, I think, because they're terrified of the secondary sanctions. And the executive order of December is interesting because the U.S. has not actually used it. They have threatened it in 3 instances, China, Turkey, and UAE. And in all 3 instances, it had the desired effect without having to be applied. We ourselves, as the EU, have now adopted a similar measure that we could use. We have also not yet used it. This is a powerful tool. The only thing I would urge all of us in the G7 plus is a little bit of caution about overusing the extraterritorial. It really doesn't make you friends, and it really pushes people to figure how they could live without us. And that's not yet likely to happen. I think the dollar dominance is going to be with us for quite some time to come. But we need to be a little bit careful that we are not going to drive people into creating alternative systems, the rise of the BRICS and so on. It's greatly exaggerated what they can do, but we should be careful if we want to maintain a broad alliance outside of the G7 and reach out to the global south and other countries like India or South Africa or Brazil. We just need to be a bit careful.
This is where we're going to see the divergence, right? Because what has worked, even though we haven't had UN mandates for the last several years, what has worked very well for the last several years is the communication between the EU, the UK, and the US on the sanctions programs. Something we've never seen before, and we can tell from the outside looking in that you're talking to each other all the time. We know that, of course, and that's been super powerful. But the hesitation to act is where we're going to split paths, because we had a situation in Colombia very recently. The president, or the phrase had something to do with, if you're not aware of this situation, but essentially there was a challenge on immigrants coming back to Colombia. The U.S. came out very forcefully and said, if you don't accept them, they mentioned sanctions, they mentioned tariffs.
Full banking sanctions.
Full banking sanctions. Put yourself in the shoes of a sanctions officer at a bank that has significant exposure to Colombia, and that hits on a Friday afternoon. I mean, do you just stay the whole weekend and run all the simulations of exposure that you have to that, because on Monday you might wake up or not? Now, what happened in that case? They reverse course, right? And if you talk to State Department, Treasury, who have been there forever, who maybe aren't the most pro-Trump in the world, they will also say, well, thank goodness, we actually threw our weight around for once, and look what the result was. I agree with you that you play that card too many times, and it's going to really cause some problems. But that's definitely going to be the future if we're talking about.
I can feel energy coming out of Dan, as when the Eagles were 22-0 up. So respond to some of that. Secondary sanctions. I mean, these are all things I've heard you talk about on telly. So give us some thoughts to what you've just heard.
Tell us what you really think, though.
He says he works for Wolfsberg, it's an international organization.
Don't let the accent fool you. He's American too, so I don't have to be the sole representative. Look, David's right. I mean, the overplaying the hand here, can be something that really drives people away. I was at the IMF World Bank annual meeting in the fall and sitting with the chairman of a large South African bank who has been the subject of some criticism from broader Western governments. And he's like, look, we'll take capital from China, we'll take it from the US. None of this is going to make us be forced to have a decision made. And that sentiment, when I talk to clients in unaligned countries, and whether it's Global South, which really is kind of wrong. I think unaligned, new neutrals, these countries don't want to make a choice. So how do you try and get them on side? I think the points you made are right, that the moral high ground definitely doesn't work. And the threat, well, unfortunately, we have an example where maybe the threat worked with Colombia. Our great national crisis with Colombia, 48 hours ended. But remember, this was an administration that sanctioned Turkey, even though they sanctioned 3 members of the Erdogan government, but destabilized the lira because of some pastor that was held under house arrest. So, we are coming to a fairly dangerous period if the US government is going to continue to weaponize itself like this, and it will drive people away. It won't meaningfully take people off the dollar, but it's going to make it a lot harder to have friends and allies to latch on to missions that actually do have some common good going forward.
So there's another part of the world that we haven't delved into yet, but obviously Dara, the corporate world, the industrial world, has terrific reliance on China. I know that there are some banks that have sort of China readiness units and all that sort of stuff. How does the corporate world think about conflict, I use that word with a very small c, but with China in the supply chain trade world?
Well, I think I was one of the compliance officers that was like, oh, I'm going to have to stand here for Colombia all weekend and see what happens. So take that exponentially 1,000 times, and that is a bit of the China prep. I do think it depends on how developed of internal team companies have. They've done certain level of preparation or not. China is, it's one of those words that I try to avoid in my line of work, but it is, we've seen such dependency, unexpected dependency and unexpected connectivity to Russia that I don't think we are conscious of what that would mean for something like China. So there is constant risk assessment, stress test scenario going, but the reality is that the impact to the supply chain, I don't think any of us here actually have a good idea of what it would mean.
Yeah, if I can jump in, and this really isn't picked up enough. China learned from Trump 1.0. They developed fairly strong retaliatory measures, but it's not being picked up. A year ago, they banned the import of gallium into the U.S., export of gallium to the U.S. Last week, they banned the export of tungsten to the U.S. Those are used to make a lot of things. Ultimately, over time, that will end up having some real supply chain implications. And I think there does need to be a heavy focus for companies, not just on what the US or other nations may be doing towards China, but also how China can respond in kind and create some real complexities for Western businesses operating in those markets, even operating at home where you're reliant on their minerals for your supply chain.
I think resilience of supply chain is something that one, it's a muscle that hadn't really been flexed, right? So I think that as much as we've worked towards globalization, we are now trying to figure out how we assess localization and how we make our supply chain resilience to this potential geopolitical reality. So I think the conclusion is, yes, it's on agendas. Yes, everyone's thinking about it. I think in medium and large enterprises, I don't know that there are good answers yet.
So one topic that one often thinks about in the context of geopolitical risk is energy. And David, there's a question here for you, and you can see where I'm going. The oil price cap is a topic which has sort of dropped a bit out of the headlines. Where are we on that? Has the oil price cap sort of run its course? And you mentioned the fact that there is still energy being bought. So where are we on that, and what might we expect?
Well, I think with all sanctions, the first question you have to ask yourself is what will we try to achieve? And I think with the oil price cap and with what we wanted to do was dent Russia's revenue. We were not going to kill it. We accepted that they were going to be able to sell crude oil to the global south and to other countries if they still wish to buy it. The oil price cap tried to put a cap on the revenue they could get from that, so to open a gap between the price of Urals crude and the price of Brent crude, which, by the way, we have by and large maintained. Today it's about $12. The Russian revenue from oil exports went down by 30% in 2023 and 20% in 2024. So, I mean, it is not gone down to zero, but it's not nothing. It harmed Russia's ability to earn money through this. And we also know, by the way, that India and China, who have continued buying large quantities, but are doing so at massive discounts and probably even below the nominal price of Urals. So I think we have dented the Russian revenue stream from their hydrocarbon. The issue which has emerged is the bypassing of the transport, because the lever for controlling the price cap is the P&I, IG insurance and transport, which is not authorized if the price cap is not being respected. So we've had Russia buying up end of life vessels and sailing them not insured by recognized insurers, perhaps not insured at all for all we know. And this has been a major source of evasion and a major ecological risk because, for example, in Europe, a lot of them are going through the Baltic Sea and through the Danish Straits. So obviously the Baltic states, Sweden and Denmark, very concerned about the risk. So what we've been doing is sanctioning the vessels. And all the evidence is that this is taking out a lot of these vessels from the shadow fleet. And we are now seeing strong evidence that Russia is struggling indeed to transport its oil. Even India and China are starting to look for alternative sources. So, the objective was to disrupt the revenue stream from Russia from the hydrocarbon. And I think we've been very successful in doing that. Is it perfect? No. Are there, ways of evasion? And part of my job is always finding new ways to address the new circumvention. And so we've had the circumvention through the shadow fleet. We are now very actively involved. The UK has also taken a very important role in this. So I think when you look at what the US, UK, and EU are doing on sanctioning those vessels, we are really enforcing the price cap in ways which are quite damaging to Russia's revenue stream.
So just to stay with you for a second, and to look forward a little bit, I'm going to go back in a second, but just to look forward a little bit, obviously you are the EU sanctions envoy, you're not the EU-Russia sanctions envoy.
Well, I am actually the Russia sanctions envoy.
Russia sanctions envoy, all right. But anyway, I'm going to...
Thankfully, I don't have to answer for the rest of the world.
But what I was thinking is obviously the first actions that we've seen, or recent actions we've seen from the Trump administration, are starting to talk about the Iran shadow fleet. So shadow fleet is not a new thing. It's been something that's been around for some time. And so I suppose the question is, my sense is that in Europe, certainly, we've learned a lot about how to manage shadow fleet risk over the last 2 or 3 years. So how might that learning be applied to the Iran situation?
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. The shadow fleet is not a completely new phenomenon. It probably started with the Iran sanctions back in 2012. I'm fascinated that the Trump administration is talking about a nuclear deal with Iran. I thought we had one. Wasn't it called the JCPOA?
You and Dan should spend more time together. You're equally skeptical.
Who withdrew from that? Was it President Trump? So, I mean, if we want to go back to having a look at whether we can leverage sanctions against Iran in order to get them to the table on nuclear, I would be all in favor. I thought we had a very good deal back in 2015. Not perfect, needed to be complemented by stuff addressing Iran's other issues, the ballistic missiles, their support for terrorism, their unhelpful behavior, all of that, and we were willing to look at that. But we had the nuclear risk wrapped up. Unfortunately, then the US withdrew, and the rest is history. If we want to go back, yes. I mean, I think if we could go back with the support of the UN General Assembly or the UN Security Council and have UN sanctions on Iranian oil exports, as we did in 2012, which was what brought the Iranians to the table, this would obviously be really effective. But I agree, the shadow fleet is a phenomenon, and it's a concern for the international community, because the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, is also very concerned because the ecological risk is for everyone, right? These clapped out vessels carrying, tons and tons of oil sailing close to coastlines could end up having a catastrophe anywhere in the world, and not sure that the insurance would be there to pay for the cleanup.
So a quick plug for our maritime sanctions task force at RUSI, which we run, which looks at exactly these issues. So if you want to have your ear bent, go talk to Gonzalo in the coffee break. I want to come back. There's a question here which riffs off something that you had said earlier, David, but I want to direct that down to you and also to Ned, which is this question about sort of how do we close the gap between what's happening in AML, in export controls, and in financial crime. I mean, what are you saying to clients, if you like, about how to wrap their arms around this?
No, it's interesting. I was thinking about it. The last time I was in this building was 5 years ago when our friend David Lewis was still at FATF and basically said the ecosystem is broken on this dais. The ecosystem is broken. The priorities are completely misaligned between policymakers, between supervisors, and between financial institutions in that instance that really just want to do the right thing and not get in trouble. Whether it's looking at AML, sanctions, export control, and fraud, and how that's interspersed together, there's a broader problem in that firms are almost expected to drive for perfection rather than actual risk management. And that's only continuing to get worse. Add in more topics that are challenging. Export control is a growing trade within a financial crime compliance function, but it's not that well injected with trade finance experience. So there's still a delta there, but I think the overall regulatory priorities that underpin what financial institutions are doing are really misaligned. They're not actually risk-based. And I can think about even 10 years ago at a large event where a US regulator who ran AML policy for supervisors came off giving public remarks and said, don't they know risk-based is dead? I mean, there is a real disconnect here in terms of what the expectation is. It's not to run widgets through a factory. It's to keep bad money out of your institution, to get bad customers out of your firms. And that's not the way firms are regulated today generally.
Ned, a perspective?
Yeah, so, I mean, if we think about some of the relationships in Washington, one of the things that's concerning about the whole world of export controls is that traditionally sits in a different side of the house in the Beltway, which is commerce, right? And if we think about Trump 1.0, we know that there were certain things that the Treasury was not prepared to do because they recognized the disruption it would have to the industry, and basically put up a challenge to Trump at the time. But Commerce was a little bit less of a check and challenge type institution, and they were very willing to kind of run and go with a whole series of export controls. What's the issue? The issue is that just like I don't understand Honeywell very well, and I should get to know Honeywell very well, Commerce doesn't understand banks that well, to be honest. And so, we know of existing guidance and draft guidance that has now got actual guidance that in its earliest forms really highlighted the lack of understanding of the financial system and the capacities and the capabilities that banks have. Now, luckily, there's an interagency process there that worked, and the guidance that came out was a lot more digestible than it could have been otherwise. But that education piece is a big thing. So when I think of kind of getting back to communication, that to me is a clear objective, which is that if Commerce is going to continue to be a stakeholder here with this kind of authority, which I can agree or disagree with, but if that's the direction of travel that the administration decides to take, then we need to do a lot of education together on that.
Those people are gone, though. The people that put out that policy advice that came out at the end of last year, they're all gone. And you've got a deregulatory bent that is certainly not going to push export control compliance into financial institutions. So then, which was a valid criticism of what can banks do to understand export control better, what can exporters do to understand the rails of payments better. But there's going to be a bit of a gap, I expect, coming forward on that in the wake of firms actually trying to spend and build up in this space.
But if I may, one of the Europe is still here. At the moment, and one of the places where clearly education is helpful, going the way that Ned was talking about, is in Europe, from corporates like Honeywell to the banking sector. So Dara, what's been your experience of, if you like, working with the banking sector to help them understand how your business operates?
So I've had great luck, but I also don't think that's an accident. I think I have good luck because I come to these forums and because I'm already kind of in the industry, and therefore a lot of these relationships are from when I was in insurance as a global head of financial crime. So I think that's been a continuation of that's my personal experience. I don't know that that's true for other industries, but I do think that the way that we continue to connect the dots is going back to what you've said, Ned, of being humble, coming to the table and saying, this is what I know about my part. I don't know what about your part. Regulator, I don't know what the intent of the policy principle is. And until we kind of get to the table and with that humility and continue to communicate, we're gonna have a really hard time. And I think, to Dan's point, I have seen a lot more collaboration, because the siloing is not just in the types of risks. The siloing is also from the regulatory side and the government side, right? So in the US, you would have commerce, but you also have state that does our ITAR our ITAR talk. And you have Treasury, and then you have DOJ, and you have the Fed, depending on generally that was really siloed. In the last year in particular, I saw much more collaboration, even on the government side, which made the relationship with industry so much more meaningful in getting to the risk. Now that those people are gone, we will have a period of time of, well, hopefully it's just a short period of time, but we're going to have to get back to the drawing board around how we get any kind of cohesive collaboration, both in the government side and in the industry. But my personal experience with banks has been very positive, but I think it's unique.
I think the other point there too is, which is, I'm in line with everything that you're saying, is that a big multinational financial institution in your corporation sitting down together, that's doable, but the scale doesn't work when you think about all the small and medium-sized businesses. And for some of our member banks who are exposed, for example, to global food supply chains from South America into Europe, and the interaction with fertilizers and Russia, there's the big players, of course, and you can sit down with those, and you will learn more in an hour than you could for reading for days. But there's still a lot of smaller players in there, and it's very difficult to engage with them.
So, David, I wanted to come to you as we start to wrap up. Obviously, you and your counterparts in the UK and the US have sort of travelled the world and worked hand in glove, and I think we already emphasised the fact that there has been this tremendous coordination. Let's assume that kind of the US, for whatever reason it might be, because someone hasn't been appointed or whatever it is sort of on the sidelines for a while. I mean, how could we imagine the EU moving forward on the Russia sanctions file kind of in the months ahead? I mean, we've heard talk of what's it called? When you don't agree things, qualified majority decisions and these kinds of things. What sort of innovations might we see?
Well, I mean, I agree. There's a great sort of unknown over the incoming administration. We can travel in hope, but the experience of the last time is not particularly encouraging for the level of coordination there's likely to be. I think we had unprecedented coordination with the outgoing administration, and that was very powerful. Also for the US, I think. Absolutely. We gained from it, but I think they did too. So I think there is a risk that we will see a bit less of that. I hope that won't be the case. I really do, but I think we have to acknowledge that. Listen, I mean, I would say this about everything. We are dealing with a different America. And as Europeans, we have to stand more on our own 2 feet in every regard, whether that's defense, and there I agree with Mr. Trump, whether that's defense, whether that is regulation. I mean, I don't think that we are going to have a massive deregulatory agenda in Europe for tech or for anything else. I think we have our values, we have our interests, and we must stand by them and defend them. And unfortunately, that may mean that America is a bit less of a partner in the future. By the way, that might have happened even if we'd had a different outcome to the election, because I think America is going through an upheaval and a kind of change, sort of what's our place in the world and how does that work? So it's not just the Trump phenomenon, it's a more general. And I think we as Europeans, I'm an unreconstructed transatlanticist, but I think we're going to have to learn to live a bit less than depending on America. And one of the earlier panelists talked about how the AML thing was very much led by the American experience, and it's also true on the sanctions. I mean, a lot of what we've been doing, we learned from America, and working with the Americans taught us a great deal. I think we're just going to have to start standing more on our own 2 feet. And I think that's, whether we can do that, there are all kinds of reasons which could lead you to be not optimistic about our ability to have the unity and to find the will. I think what we've done on sanctions against Russia is nothing short of a miracle, with unanimity. We've got 16 packages. We've got the strongest. When I was ambassador in Washington in 2014, 2015, after the first sanctions on Russia, everyone kept saying to me, "You Europeans, you'll never hold the line. You'll break. You won't take sanctions against Russia." We've done it. So we are capable of doing it. But honestly, it's our big challenge, learning to stand on our own 2 feet in a number of areas, because America is not going to be there for us in the future in the way it has been in the past.
So before I come to Dan for a last comment, I just wanted to follow up slightly there, David, which is that obviously when we think about sanctions, that's kind of part of this finance and security landscape. There's a big focus on economic security in Brussels. Indeed, your former colleague has moved across the economic security side. So I just wonder, is your experience and your knowledge and that of those around you being plugged into a kind of broader conversation about sort of the EU and economic security?
Well, I mean, it's as Dara said. I mean, it's ultimately about resilience, and it's about having the capacity to resist the collapse of supply chains from various parts of the world, having the ability to find alternative sources, not being excessively dependent on anyone. For supplies of minerals, for supplies of critical equipment, as we saw during the pandemic, for energy, and so forth. So I think for me, that's what economic security means. It's not about isolationism. And by the way, you will have noticed we've just signed a free trade deal with Mercosur. We've just upgraded the deal with Mexico. Europe is very much still in the business of open trade and globalization with a sort of footnote that we don't want to become overly dependent, and we want to retain the ability to control our own destiny. That's what economic security is. And sanctions is a part of that, because unfortunately with Russia, we're now in a major struggle about who writes the rules in the 21st century in Europe. Is it the army of Mr. Putin, or is it a rules-based multilateral system? That's the struggle, so we have to push back, but someday in the future, maybe we will be in a different world. So that's, for me, as I say, it's just about Europe having to stand on its own 2 feet much more in the future than we have in the past.
And Dan, faced with that far from clear landscape, what are banks meant to do on the US side of the Atlantic, on this side of the Atlantic? What's your advice? Go large. Hail Mary.
I didn't realize this was supposed to be a support group today. What I think firms need to be careful of, especially now, especially where we become a bit more challenging or complicated to deal with, is not rushing to make any sort of proactive changes to your business to compliance, but really trying to assess exposure as rapidly as possible. We've certainly seen the market is beginning to price in some of the mercurial nature of the new American president, but it is important for people that work in this space to counsel their businesses to also understand exposure but not immediately react. And I think that is going to be something we're used to dealing with. We dealt with it for 4 years before. But I think that's probably the most important trait right now, is not rushing to conclusions, but also trying to understand the 360 issue for some of these issues. To Dara's point on supply chain resiliency, like that is going to be a bigger issue, not just for industrial companies and manufacturers, but for financial institutions and insurers that finance and help move these goods as well.
So in summary, strap in, keep calm, and carry on. So thank you all very much indeed for your time. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.